In the quiet town of Willowbrook, a peculiar old man named Mr. Jenkins tended to his garden every morning. His allotment was the pride of the community, a riot of color and life that stood out starkly against the uniform greenness of the surrounding lawns. His neighbors often commented on his uncanny ability to coax even the most stubborn of plants to bloom, and children would occasionally stop by to ask for the secret behind his gardening prowess. He'd smile and ruffle their hair, sharing nonsensical advice that always seemed to work wonders when they tried it themselves. Mr. Jenkins was a man of few words, but his plants spoke volumes about his gentle nature. One fateful day, however, a chilling wind swept through the town, bringing with it a sense of unease that even the most skeptical of residents couldn't ignore. The air grew thick with an unpleasant scent, a miasma of decay that seemed to cling to everything it touched. Mr. Jenkins noticed it first, his nose wrinkling in disgust as he stepped out of his cottage, coffee in hand, to greet the morning. The leaves of his plants hung limp, and their once vibrant colors had begun to fade. Concerned, he knelt down to inspect the soil, but the moment his hand touched the earth, a cold shiver ran up his spine. Something was very wrong. Buried in the rich loam, a tiny, jet-black seedling poked through the surface, stark against the dull brown. It grew at an alarming rate, stretching towards the sky like a shadowy tendril. Buried in the rich loam, a tiny, jet-black seedling poked through the surface, stark against the dull brown. It grew at an alarming rate, stretching towards the sky like a shadowy tendril reaching for the sun. Mr. Jenkins watched in horror as it unfurled leaves that shimmered with a sickly sheen and bore flowers with petals as black as the darkest night. They fluttered in the breeze, whispering in a language he didn't recognize but somehow understood. The message was clear: a malevolent force approached Willowbrook, one that threatened the very fabric of the town's peaceful existence. The whispers grew louder with each passing day, the petals of the black flowers moving with a mind of their own, spelling out words that danced at the edge of his vision. "Beware," they warned, "the shadow is coming." Mr. Jenkins tried to ignore them, to dismiss them as a trick of the light or perhaps the onset of dementia, but the urgency in their voices grew stronger. He knew he had to do something, but what could an old man with a green thumb do against an unknown evil? As the whispers grew more frantic, Mr. Jenkins' thoughts turned to the children who so often sought him out for gardening advice. If the shadow were to come, they would be the most vulnerable. He resolved to protect them, to find a way to banish this dark presence before it could harm those he cared for. His once gentle eyes grew steely with determination, and he set to work, his calloused hands moving with a newfound purpose. The townspeople began to whisper about the changes in him, the way he worked tirelessly in his garden day and night, but none knew the truth of the horror that grew alongside his beloved plants. The black plant continued its alarming growth, stretching its branches out over the fence and into the neighboring gardens. It seemed to feed on the very essence of Willowbrook, draining the color from the surrounding flora, leaving a trail of desolation in its wake. The townsfolk took note of the withered plants and Mr. Jenkins' erratic behavior but kept their distance, fearful of what the whispers might bring. Only Mrs. Thompson, the town's librarian, noticed the desperation in his eyes when he came to her, seeking ancient tomes on botany and local folklore. She offered her assistance, though she too felt the chilling presence that hovered over the town. Together, they pored over dusty volumes filled with the arcane knowledge of generations past. They discovered that the plant was a rare and malevolent species, known as the Shadow's Herald. It grew only when a great evil approached, acting as a harbinger of doom. The whispers, they learned, were not mere figments of their imagination but the plant's attempt to communicate the nature of the impending danger. As the days grew shorter and the whispers grew clearer, they pieced together the cryptic warnings: "Beware the moonless night," it sang, "when the shadow takes flight." The town's anticipation grew to a fever pitch as the moonless night approached. Mr. Jenkins and Mrs. Thompson prepared a potent concoction they hoped would destroy the herald. Armed with ancient texts and a stew of herbs that smelled of earth and decay, they approached the monstrous plant at the stroke of midnight. The air was thick with the scent of rain, the clouds above them a brooding canopy that threatened to unleash a tempest. The whispers had reached a crescendo, the words now clear and demanding, "Feast on their fear, let darkness appear." It was then they realized that the plant was not just announcing the shadow's arrival but actively summoning it. They had to act quickly. With trembling hands, Mr. Jenkins poured the steaming liquid over the herald's roots while Mrs. Thompson recited an incantation in a language that seemed to predate the very town itself. The plant writhed and shrieked, its black petals shriveling and falling to the ground like the ash of a forgotten fire. The whispers grew to a howl, and the ground beneath them began to tremble. But as the last droplet of the potion seeped into the soil, the plant let out a final, mournful cry before withering away to nothing. The tremors ceased, and the air grew still. The two stood, exhausted but hopeful, surveying the damage done to the garden. Yet, the sense of unease remained. Had they truly stopped the shadow, or merely postponed its arrival? They knew that the battle was not over, that the real horror had only just begun. Willowbrook was now on a countdown to an encounter with the malevolent force that lurked in the shadows, and it was up to them to prepare the town for the horrors that lay ahead. With the first drops of rain, Mr. Jenkins looked up to the sky, knowing that the storm was just the opening act of a much darker night to come. The following days saw Mr. Jenkins and Mrs. Thompson sharing their findings with the townsfolk, though few believed their tale of an otherworldly menace. They were met with skepticism and, in some cases, outright hostility. But they persevered, sharing their knowledge and preparing for the worst. They gathered the strongest and bravest of Willowbrook's children, teaching them the basics of the natural world's power and the importance of standing together in the face of fear. They hoped that if the shadow did come, the children would be the town's beacon of hope. In the quiet moments between preparations, Mr. Jenkins found himself drawn to the spot where the herald had once stood. He knelt down, feeling the cool earth beneath his knees, and whispered his own silent plea for guidance. To his surprise, a faint response echoed back to him, a whisper so faint that he questioned his own sanity. It spoke of an ancient spell, one that could banish the shadow for good, but required a sacrifice of pure heart and unblemished soul. The cost was high, and he knew that the town might never recover from it. Yet, the alternative was unthinkable. As the moonless night drew closer, the air grew colder, the whispers grew fainter. It was as if the herald's destruction had sent ripples through the fabric of the town, alerting the shadow to the presence of those who dared to oppose it. Mr. Jenkins felt the weight of the decision pressing down upon him, his heart heavy with the knowledge of what he had to do. He called the children to him, their faces a mix of fear and determination. He told them the truth, laying out the grim reality of the situation and the price that must be paid. To a child, they nodded, understanding the gravity of their situation. The night of the new moon finally arrived, casting a pallor over Willowbrook that seemed to swallow all light. The townsfolk huddled in their homes, the whispers now a distant memory, replaced by the deafening silence of dread. Mr. Jenkins and Mrs. Thompson stood before the children, a circle of innocence in the face of the encroaching dark. They recited the ancient words, their voices strong and unwavering, as they painted a symbol of protection in the dirt with a mixture of herbs and soil. The children's eyes glowed with a light that seemed to fend off the shadows that grew ever closer. The tension grew palpable as the sky remained stubbornly starless. Then, without warning, a chilling wind tore through the streets, carrying with it the scent of decay. The shadow had come. Mr. Jenkins and Mrs. Thompson hurriedly brought the children inside his cottage, the walls groaning as the wind grew in fury. The windows rattled, and outside, the plants in the garden bent low as if in fear. The whispers grew clearer, the petals of the dead herald fluttering in the breeze, forming shapes that spelled out the final warnings. "Find the heart of the shadow," the petals whispered. "Only there can you end its reign." The children looked to Mr. Jenkins with wide eyes, and he knew the time had come for him to make the ultimate sacrifice. He nodded solemnly and took the children's hands, leading them to the center of the circle of protection they had drawn. The floorboards creaked beneath their feet as the cottage trembled with the shadow's approach. Suddenly, the door burst open, and the shadow itself filled the doorway, a monstrous silhouette with eyes that burned like embers in the dark. The children gasped, but Mr. Jenkins stood firm, his eyes locked with the creature's fiery gaze. He knew what he had to do. "I am the heart of Willowbrook," he declared, his voice surprisingly strong. "Take my fear, and leave my town in peace." The shadow's eyes narrowed, sensing the truth in his words. It reached out a tendril, seeking to claim Mr. Jenkins' fear, but found only the warmth of his love for the town and its people. The children clung to him, their own fears momentarily forgotten in the face of his bravery. Mrs. Thompson, seeing the opportunity, chanted the final words of the ancient spell, her voice rising above the howling wind. The symbol in the center of the circle began to glow, casting a warm, golden light that pushed back the shadow's inky embrace. The creature roared in fury, its form flickering as if it were being torn apart by some unseen force. With a final surge of power, Mr. Jenkins stepped forward, offering his pure heart to the light. The shadow recoiled, its eyes dimming as the warmth of his sacrifice flooded the room. The tendril retreated, and the creature's form grew weaker, dissolving into the night from which it had come. The cottage fell silent, the wind dying down outside. The children looked up at Mr. Jenkins, tears in their eyes, understanding the price he had paid for their safety. But there was something else in their gaze, a newfound respect, a bond forged in the face of unspeakable horror. The town of Willowbrook awoke the next morning to find the world bathed in a soft, gentle light, the malevolence of the shadow vanquished. The children grew into strong, wise adults, guiding their community with the lessons Mr. Jenkins had taught them. His garden remained a symbol of hope, the spot where the herald had once stood now a place of remembrance and strength. The whispers of the black petals were never heard again, but the legacy of Mr. Jenkins' sacrifice lived on. His garden continued to bloom, a testament to the power of love and courage in the face of unspeakable darkness. And though the shadow had been defeated, the townsfolk knew that vigilance was key. For in the quiet corners of the world, where darkness still lurked, evil could always find a foothold. But in Willowbrook, they had found the light that would forever keep the shadows at bay.